we've got very good biodiversity data, but we don't really know enough about the cultural side of it. So Ben, Wallace and myself, we got to talking. It just so happened that Historic England were looking at ecosystem services as well. We were talking to the Environment Agency, and we went to a meeting, a workshop, where the two had come together to try and incorporate this landscape cultural element into ecosystem services. So it was just a happy coincidence, and once we got talking about it, hence we thought, well, we're going to involve a cultural aspect to it. And that's the reason Ben's here to explain that missing component.
At that meeting, it was sort of a seminar, and it was called Ecosystem Services and the Historic Environment. At that meeting, every presenter stood up and they said, "I have a confession to make. Yeah, I'm not an ecologist, or I'm not an archaeologist. You know, I'm a geographer. You know, I was trained in something else. So my confession is, I'm an archaeologist. I'm not a natural environment specialist. I'm not an ecologist. Yeah. Any other archaeologists in the room? No. There you go, you see. So that's my confession for the day. So, my name's Ben Wallace. I'm the Historic Environment Record Manager at Warwickshire County Council, and I'm going to explain what all that means and what some of this stuff up on there means as well. But, because this is after lunch and you're all feeling sleepy, yeah, I'm going to do a little bit of a test with you. Okay, it's just a game, it's just for fun. Yeah, you have to guess what this is. Yeah? Okay, you've got that. Plus that.
Graveyard shift.
Hey, graveyard shift, yeah? Because I'm doing the graveyard shift. Right, everybody awake now? Good. Landscape ecology and historic environment. That is the team I'm in. This is the team that Dave Lowe manages, and I thought it would be quite handy just to explain what each of our individual teams do within that wider team. And then you might understand where I'm coming from the historic environment. The landscape team, we've got landscape professionals in the county council, within our service, and they produce things like this: landscape studies and landscape sensitivity studies and landscape assessments. They were around when we were doing the landscape characterisation, which was called the Warwickshire Landscape Guidelines many years ago, and in some ways it's still relevant today. And the more you look at that, I go back and look at it and read some of the things that are written, it's very, very good. Landscape, we'll come back to that. Okay, ecology, yeah, now we've talked about some of the ecology team, but I thought I'd highlight, you've got the Biological Record Centre, fantastic data resource. There we go, there's a very, very old, out-of-date map. I've already apologised to Lois, who manages the Biological Record Centre, that this is the only one I could find at the time, yeah, and she'll give me a new one after this meeting. But the ecology team do other things as well, rather than just manage the Biological Record Centre. You know, something like this. The BAT project, and going out there recording things, planning advice as well. It's not just one aspect of it. It's looking at natural environment from different angles. And then you've got historic environment, this archaeological information advice team. Yeah. Now, like the HBA, it does what it says on the tin. Yeah. We give information and advice. It's pretty simple. There is our information. That's part of the historic environment record. There we go, some lovely map stuff as well. And we were saying earlier about data sets that could come into use for something like this. I've got some fantastic data for you, yeah? And it's not just in Warwickshire as well. The stuff I'm going to show you is reproduced across the whole of England, unlike the HBA, yeah? Which is fantastic and should be celebrated, but it's a shame that you don't get that everywhere. So, there's historic environment record, that's what I manage. And we also give advice, planning advice as well. So there's your traditional site of archaeology with the dumper truck behind it. And the HBA. Now, not officially, technically part of our team, but I think I like to think they are. They sit right next to us. We're all a friendly bunch. We should sort of share information, what we're doing, what we're up to. And the HBA, fantastic resource. And the HBA has been used by my own team in the historic environment and in some of the projects we do, because the data is so good. And likewise, I'd like to think that some of the data we've generated from the historic environment could go back into the HBA in some way. And I'll touch on that a bit later. And you know, this we've seen these pictures before, but I am impressed by that as well. And in the historic environment profession, we work with a lot of data as well. So, ecosystem services and cultural value, we've already had a fantastic explanation of ecosystem services. I'm still learning about this. This is new for me. This is not in my sort of profession and background, so I have to sort of, rapidly come to speed. But it's this interesting stuff. Now, I've just picked a very simple one, because what I wanted to talk about was sort of this thing, which we touched upon. And you look at it like that, and you get, the provisioning, regulating, cultural. A lot of this makes sense. It makes sense to me, and then you look at this, and I'm like, oh God, how are you going to do that? I know how hard it is to ask people what they think and to value things in terms of the historic environment, the history, the archaeology. It's all different. It's very personal. It's all subjective. That's the odd one out, and it has been, in these discussions that everybody's had. So then I went along, I'll find something that makes a bit more sense to me. And, it's not a map, but it's kind of a diagram thing. And I looked at this and I thought, culture, that's me, that is. That's what I thought. I thought that's historic environment. Look, there's a windmill, that could be Chesterton. There's a castle, it could be Warwick. And that's what it's being portrayed as well in the past. Cultural value is maybe the historic environment. And that's where we were sort of thinking until we went to that seminar. And all these other things as well started to make a bit more sense to me as well. However, it's not like that at all. If you look at the historic environment, and it makes it easier to think of it just as landscape, it's all of these things. Yes, it's the sea, it's this bit, it's those buildings, it's the agriculture, it's the windmill, it's the towns, it's the woodland, because they're all managed and manipulated by humans. Pretty much everything in this country is managed, constrained, messed about with, built, cut down by humans. That makes it part of the historic environment, and it tells us something about us, who we are, and about our past as well. That's a very important thing. So, if it is all of this, what we want to do is we want to get back to that. We want cultural services to be the really hard thing to understand, what people think. That's what it should be. And you were saying before, we shouldn't just throw that away and say, it's something else, or it's too hard to do. We have to do that. That is really important. But historic environment fits in to all of this, and that's the important thing. How are we doing that now? How are we making sure that the understanding of the historic environment, the understanding of our landscape out there is properly accounted for when you look at using ecosystem services? And that's something we touched upon in the conference we went to, and that's something that I want to talk about as well. But first, I'll go back to that historic environment definition. There's a definition for you from NPPF, okay? And a bit I just want to draw your attention to is a bit at the bottom, which says, it's monumental landscape planted or resulting environmental facets from flora to fauna and biodiversity. And so, yes, you can say, when you're looking at your pictures, I find things that are natural. I looked at them, and all I saw was historic environment. I saw an historic bridge, I saw some managed trees and hedgerows, and I just saw archaeology and history. But you saw nature, and that's really interesting. So we've got the HBA with fantastic habitat data, biological record centre as well, we've got land use maps, we've got various other things. And the missing element, I think, is the historic environment. We need to just get that in there. It's accepted pretty much now, and we need to find a way of doing it. So, everything related to humans in the past, everything, that's historic environment. It's really important. It's that, all of that. Bridge and furrow, those hedgerows, those trees, those fields, that's all historic environment. And it's all the urban areas as well, which is a bit sometimes you guys find hard to tackle. That's historic environment. We've got lots of data for that. So, it's really interesting. And just an example there, just something completely different. It's a bombing decoy site over in Solihull. But if you look at it there, I bet you that comes up as something on the HBA. Yeah? That's okay, you can have both. It has an added value now because it was a bombing decoy site. And it may mean something to somebody who lives nearby. And they may not understand the nature value of it, but they understand what it tells them about their past and their history. Or the other way around. They might not even know it was a bombing decoy site, but then we can tell them and they understand and value it more. And there we go, there's a map of some of the data that the Historic Environment Record has. And these are mainly what you might call historic assets or monuments, covering the county. We also manage Solihull as well, and Coventry is a separate historic environment record managed by Coventry City Council. So, monuments I've mentioned. We also record archaeological activity. So these are all the events where people have gone out and discovered the past, whether it's professional archaeologists doing field work or whether it's somebody walking their dog and finding a flint in the ground. That shows you where people have been and understood something about the past. Historic landscape character, I'll come on to in a minute, and this is covering the whole of the area with no white spaces. Here you can see all the gaps between the archaeological sites. Historic landscape character looks at everything. And historic farmsteads, ridge and furrow, and something called the National Mapping Programme. And all of that is together with GIS, databases, and reports and physical archives. So, one of these I'll just show you is examples of some of the data we have. This is the National Mapping Programme data and what's happened here. Aerial photographs have been looked at, not too dissimilar to when you're looking at the HBA, and we're looking for archaeological sites. And then they map them and colour them in, the archaeological sites, and we record that information. So here, now this is just near sort of Meriden, you've got charcoal production. Yeah? Fascinating. So what does that tell us? You'd have to have the woodland, and you have to have the woodland at the time they were doing that charcoal production. So that tells you something about the habitat there from hundreds of years ago. We can use this information together in a really fantastic way. And that's really interesting for us because that tells you how people were living and managing that resource there at that time. They're doing it in a sort of an industrial level. Look at how many there are. Here we have edge of a Roman camp and an Iron Age field boundaries and Iron Age settlement as well, prehistoric settlement. So you're looking at a very old landscape. These sort of enclosure patterns, those are field boundaries that are thousands of years old. So we can look back at a landscape that has gone for a very long time and tell us something about it. And over here we've got ridge and furrow near Diddington Hall, and we've got the direction of the ridge and furrow and the edges of them. That has all been ploughed out, that's all gone. You can't see that anymore, but we know it was there from the aerial photographs. And that can tell us something about the habitat of that area as well. Now I mentioned the Warwickshire Historic Landscape Characterisation Project, and this is where we looked at the whole county, including Solihull. There's a very odd bit here, which is the Cotswolds, that's a different one. And Coventry have done their own, that's covered as well. So there's no white areas, and we've recently been taking all this data with Natural England and producing a national historic landscape character data set. That project is ongoing, and that's looking to feed in something at a higher level that will go into everything from sort of very, very high level strategic planning, decision making, targeting, all kinds of things. But at a local level, this is what you get. And it's recording every area with a broad historic landscape character down to a subtype level. It's not too dissimilar to the HBA, but we're looking at historic landscapes. And we're recording all the urban areas of different types of urban areas, how they've developed over time, a variety of things. So this tells me what the historic landscape looks like currently now, but it tells me something about its past as well. Very quick example, these sort of brown colours, these are what we call piecemeal enclosure or irregular enclosure. They tend to be of an older date, possibly from late medieval or post-medieval, so you're talking about 16th, 17th century. And in these areas you often get ridge and furrow surviving. You get very curvilinear field boundaries, fantastic hedgerows, you get hedgerow trees. They're very small parcels, usually very small fields, very irregular. My mind is they're very good for species. Yeah. And then these areas where you've got the sort of the orangey yellow colour, this is planned enclosure, usually 18th or 19th century in date. Very, very straight field boundaries, larger rectangular fields, not quite as good probably for species, not as much ridge and furrow, intensively farmed. But this tells us something about the pattern of the landscape around us and how it developed over time. In developing this, we came up with these types, and these are different to each area, but we're working on drawing them together in a national thesaurus. And one of the ones we came up with is for woodland, because woodland we see as historic environment, and you'll see this one here, identified by the Forestry Commission and the Warwickshire Habitat Biodiversity Audit, and I'm just an example of how we use their data to influence and inform the historic landscape character. But you could take this data and send it back as well. So we've got 20 years of how habitats have changed. Well, I can give you this and we can go back another 100, or even further. You'll have gaps, you'll have issues, but you can tell things about where that woodland was. And I've got it mapped. I can tell you where the woodland was 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And I can tell you what the type of woodland was as well. And I can also tell you where I think there may be woodland based on what the fields used to look like 100 years ago, and where it looks like they've actually encroached into the woodland and cut it out. Even though we've got no evidence for woodland there at all, it looks like there was woodland there. So we can make lots of use of this data and maybe peel back time in terms of species and habitats at some point. Another thing we looked at was in the urban areas I mentioned before, and this is an extensive urban survey for Warwickshire, looking at 20 historic towns across Warwickshire, and going down to individual groups of buildings level. The roads, the railways, the stations, the buildings, the squares, and actually recording their historic character and how they've changed over time. And looking at the historic town and how it developed from its inception through to now. And this is very useful stuff when you're looking at planning later on, and you're looking at the shape of some of these plots and houses, and you're deciding to change them fundamentally. Perhaps it's something to consider, that these plots are there for a reason based on something that may be 500 or 1,000 years old. And actually changing how they work changes the historic character overall. But it's data that can be used in that kind of decision making. So I was thinking also about the ecosystem services and how we were actually practically implementing it. And I thought, actually, maybe we've been doing it anyway without realising, or I've been doing it without realising, and probably people who thought of these things, this was always the plan. But agri-environment schemes, the historic environment record has a key role to play, and has done for a very long time. So you remember this was the old countryside stewardship scheme, MAF, if anybody remembers that? Yeah, oh wow, those were the days, eh? And then we had the environmental stewardship scheme, high level, yeah. Oh, look, a bit of historic environment, yeah, lovely, nice meadow. And then you've got countryside stewardship. What happened to the nice photos? What? Anyway, countryside stewardship again, yeah. Here we are again. Right. How do we get involved in the historic environment? Well, we've been very lucky. Our Association of Local Government Archaeological Officers have campaigned very hard, we're very close with Natural England, and made sure the historic environment is taken into account. We have this lovely online system in the new countryside stewardship, which is called SHINE. And here we've got historic environment data from the HER, from the Historic Environment Record, feeding in so that decisions can be made on those applications for agri-environment schemes at mid-tier and higher tier level. And what's more, when we get an application come through, it's notified on this web system, we go in and we can draw areas of the most important historic environment assets. And then we can draw management areas and how to manage them and which options to choose to manage that historic environment most effectively. And it's all done on value-based, how much evidence we've got for understanding that resource of the historic environment, how much value is there to actually managing it in a certain way, and the benefit. This really, for me, seems like ecosystem services. It seems like it's doing what was originally thought of. What's the value? How can you get the benefit? How does it, is this being assessed with all of the other aspects of ecosystem services? Yes, it is. This is the historic environment bit. It's feeding in and it's being balanced from that application against the other things. So it's taking into account the value. And the landowner, the farmer at the end of the day, can look at it and say, right, I get that much for actually managing it as an arable field, I'll get that much if I turn it to grassland, I'll get that much if I put a buffer in, or if I actually reduce my plough depth and don't destroy the archaeology below the ground, I'll get that much. And they have to weigh up what is worth it. So we are really keen on continuing this and seeing if, hopefully, this will continue in some way. We spent a lot of time developing the system and getting our data in. And hopefully it will continue so we can take it into account the historic environment. In one of the biggest things that actually does most damage and change, believe it or not, agri-environment. Another way we've been involved is neighbourhood planning. What we've done is we've developed some workshops with funding from Historic England as pilots to go out and talk to people about the historic environment and to get them to have a look at their own areas and to try and quantify it and take account in their neighbourhood plans. Come up with some decent policies. We have information they can have. If our information is bad, they can tell us, and I will make sure it's corrected. And this is what we do. We go out, we spend a day with them, we have a look at things in terms of landscape, we talk about the other information that's out there, Biological Record Centre, the HBA, and often they've already got the data anyway, which is fantastic, and if they haven't, they can be prompted. And we also look at things from a landscape level, and we talk about the natural environment as well. So it's all tied in. We're only looking from the historic environment perspective, but we can't ignore the fact that it's all tied in together. And they value all of it. We give them some ways of recording historic buildings very, very quickly, and they can send it back to us and we can add them onto the historic environment record. A material consideration in planning, nonetheless, very handy to have if you're in a local area. We give them a way of mapping their own area. Very simple sort of key, you don't have to read that, it's just some colours representative of different things in their area that they can draw. And then they can go out and draw it. And it just gets them to step back and have a look at their area. And that's one of the hardest things to do. It's hard for me, it's hard for anybody, is when you live in an area is to step back and see what you've actually got. You get very focused on your own little area, your own thing, and it's very hard to take a look and see at the bigger picture. And this is just a way of doing it. They can take that information and then look at policies about what it is that's important for them. What do they want to protect? How do they want to protect it? Are there any gaps? Are there any opportunities? And we tell them to look at things like that. Opportunities where they can make things better for their area. So there we go. So I sort of rambled on really about, cultural value, historic environment, and these are some final thoughts. Now some of this has come out of our sort of, conference we went to. But I put these together and then I found the questions we were asked at the beginning of our conference. And actually they're very similar, yeah? So we've come around to the same conclusions, which is very, very satisfying. So how does the historic environment fit with ecosystem services, with the natural environment and with landscape? So that's a sort of question. How can we make it fit better? And I think what we should be doing is looking at some really good examples of how this can be done. We could look at agri-environment and say, yes, that might be an example of how it's being done. I think we need some more really good examples. Using all the data we got, Warwickshire is a brilliant place to do this. We can take HBA data, we take Biological Record Centre data, take all the HR information, put it together, and then start to feed it into an ecosystem services idea, and then some practical examples of being used. Maybe even down to planning casework level. If you've got somebody looking at an area quite small, can we use all of that together and make a difference? So there we go, I've said that. And these were the questions that were at the beginning of the conference, yeah? And it's very, very similar. And I only came back to this afterwards, and I thought, I'll check those. Opportunities for integrating story, no, we've got there, brilliant. And then how can it be used in practical application? Yes, it's the same thing. We're all saying the same things. This is how I'm going to show you everything is relevant, yeah? It's all relevant. There it is, St. Peter's Church. Anybody want to know where that is? Wootton Warren. Yeah. Okay, there's the church, there's the graveyard. So that picture, from Flickr, by the way, that is in the graveyard there at Wootton Warren. There's an aerial photograph. I'm sure a lot of people see a nice, lovely bit of nature there as well. We've got a record on our historic environment record. That's Time Trail, our website. We've all got a leaflet, and I put it on your chair in lunch, so you can go and have a look at it. That's our record for it in terms of how we understand the church. And this is what I see as well. Church, gravestones, listed buildings, other parts of archaeology, archaeological excavation that's taken place, wider historic landscape, remnants of ridge and furrow, graveyard, it goes on and on and on. It's a whole landscape. And that's just from that. There we go. Thank you very much.